There's something that happens around 30 that no one really prepares you for. It's not the wrinkles or the gray hairs or even the way your body starts demanding different things from you. It's something quieter, more insidious. It's the gradual realization that somewhere along the way, you've built a life that feels less like living and more like existing. You wake up in the morning and the day stretches ahead of you like a series of checkboxes to tick off, obligations to fulfill, expectations to meet. And at the end of it all, when you finally collapse into bed, there's this hollow feeling, this sense that you've been running on a treadmill that's going nowhere. Henry David Thoreau understood this feeling intimately. In 1845, at the age of 27, he made a decision that would puzzle his contemporaries and inspire generations to come. He walked away from conventional society and built himself a small cabin by Walden Pond. For 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, he lived there, not as an escape from life, but as an experiment in truly living. What he discovered there offers us a blueprint for understanding why so many of us feel trapped after 30, and more importantly, how we can break free. Thoreau wrote that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. He wasn't being dramatic or pessimistic. He was observing a fundamental truth about human nature that becomes especially pronounced as we enter our 30s. By this age, we've accumulated enough experiences to know what we don't want, but we've also accumulated enough responsibilities, expectations, and habits that changing course feels almost impossible. We've built what society tells us is a successful life, but inside, we're suffocating under the weight of it all. The trap isn't necessarily the job, though it might be. It's not necessarily the mortgage or the car payments or the social obligations, though these certainly play their part. The real trap is something far more subtle and far more pervasive. It's the way we've learned to live unconsciously, moving through our days on autopilot, making decisions based on what we think we should want, rather than what actually brings us alive. We've become experts at optimizing for things that don't ultimately matter while neglecting the very essence of what makes life worth living. Thoreau called this phenomenon the accumulation of the superfluous. We surround ourselves with things, commitments, and activities that we believe will make us happy, successful, or worthy of love and respect. But each addition to our lives, rather than enriching us, actually diminishes our capacity for genuine experience. We become like collectors who are so busy acquiring new pieces that we never actually look at or appreciate what we already have. Our attention becomes fractured, our energy scattered, our sense of purpose diluted. Consider the typical day of someone in their 30s. They wake up to an alarm that jolts them from whatever dreams they were having. Immediately, they reach for their phone, flooding their barely conscious mind with notifications, news, social media updates, emails that demand immediate attention. Before they've even fully awakened, they're already behind, already feeling the pressure to catch up with a world that never stops moving. They rush through breakfast, if they have breakfast at all, listening to podcasts or checking messages, multitasking their way through what should be one of the most peaceful moments of the day. The commute becomes another exercise in efficiency, rather than an opportunity for reflection or simply being present. They arrive at work and spend 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours in environments that drain their energy and creativity, solving problems they don't care about, making money for people whose values they don't share, contributing to systems they don't believe in. They come home exhausted, not just physically but spiritually, too tired to do anything meaningful with their evening except collapse in front of screens that offer the illusion of relaxation while actually keeping their minds agitated and their spirits restless. This is the life of quiet desperation that Thoreau observed, and it's become even more pronounced in our hyper-connected, always-on modern world. We've created lives that are simultaneously overstimulated and undernourished, packed with activity but starved of meaning. filled with connections, but empty of true intimacy, both with others and with ourselves. But here's what Thoreau discovered at Walden Pond, and what his experiment can teach us today. The solution isn't to run away to the woods, though that might be appealing on particularly difficult days. The solution is to learn the art of deliberate living, to become conscious architects of our own experience rather than passive victims of circumstance. Thoreau went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if he could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when he came to die, discover that he had not lived. Living deliberately means making conscious choices about how we spend our time, energy, and attention. It means regularly examining our lives to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely habitual. It means being willing to let go of things that no longer serve us, even if letting go feels uncomfortable or if others don't understand our choices. Most importantly, it means cultivating the courage to live according to our own values rather than the expectations others have placed upon us or that we've placed upon ourselves. The feeling of being trapped after 30 often comes from the realization that we've been living someone else's definition of success or happiness. We've internalized messages about what a good life looks like, what we should want, what we should prioritize, and we've organized our entire existence around achieving these externally imposed goals. But somewhere deep inside, we know that these goals aren't actually ours. They're hand-me-downs from our parents, our culture, our peer group, our younger selves who didn't yet know who we really were or what we really wanted. Thoreau's time at Walden was essentially an extended meditation on this question of what we actually need to be happy and fulfilled. By stripping away everything that wasn't essential, he was able to see clearly what remained. He discovered that most of what we think we need for happiness is actually unnecessary. And worse, these unnecessary things often actively prevent us from experiencing genuine contentment and peace. He found that he needed very little in terms of material possessions. His cabin was small and simple, furnished with just the basics. He grew much of his own food, prepared simple meals, wore simple clothes. This wasn't because he was opposed to comfort or beauty, but because he discovered that the pursuit of increasingly elaborate comforts and possessions was a distraction from the real business of living. Every hour spent earning money to buy things he didn't really need was an hour not spent in contemplation, in nature, in genuine connection with life itself. This doesn't mean we all need to live in cabins and grow our own beans, though there's certainly wisdom in both activities. What it means is that we need to regularly examine our lives to see where we might be spending time, energy, and resources on things that don't actually contribute to our well-being or fulfillment. For most people, this examination reveals that they're carrying enormous amounts of unnecessary baggage, both literal and metaphorical. The literal baggage is the stuff that fills our homes, the subscriptions we've forgotten about, the clothes we never wear, the gadgets we never use, the books we'll never read, the equipment for hobbies we've abandoned. But the metaphorical baggage is even more significant. It's the commitments we've made to activities that drain us, the relationships that diminish rather than nourish us, the habits that no longer serve us, the beliefs about ourselves and the world that keep us small and afraid. Thoreau wrote that a man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. This is perhaps one of the most radical ideas in his entire philosophy, and it's especially relevant for people feeling trapped in their 30s and beyond. We've been conditioned to believe that more is always better, that accumulation equals progress, that adding things to our lives is the path to happiness. But Thoreau suggests the opposite. True wealth, true freedom, true happiness comes from Our ability to say no, to let go, to choose less rather than more. This principle applies to every area of life. In our careers, it means focusing on work that aligns with our values and uses our gifts, rather than just pursuing the next promotion or salary increase. In our relationships, it means investing deeply in a few meaningful connections, rather than trying to maintain superficial relationships with everyone we've ever met. In our homes, it means surrounding ourselves with things we actually use and love rather than things we think we should have or things that represent who we used to be. But perhaps most importantly, it means learning to let go of the stories we tell ourselves about who we're supposed to be. By the time we reach 30, most of us have accumulated decades of identity, both self-imposed and imposed by others. We think we know who we are based on our past choices, our education, our career, our relationships, our successes and failures. But these stories, while they contain truth, can also become prisons that prevent us from growing and changing. Thoreau's experiment at Walden was partly about discovering who he was when stripped of all the external markers of identity. Without the constant input and feedback from society, without the daily routines and obligations that usually define us, who was he really? What remained when everything else was taken away? This is the question that anyone feeling trapped in their life needs to explore. The process of answering this question requires solitude, something that's increasingly rare in our connected world. Thoreau spent long hours alone, walking in the woods, sitting by the pond, observing the changes in nature, reading, writing, thinking. This wasn't loneliness or antisocial behavior. It was the deliberate cultivation of the relationship with himself, the development of his inner life, the practice of being present with his own thoughts and feelings without distraction. Most of us are terrified of true solitude because we've lost touch with our inner lives. We've become so accustomed to external stimulation, to constant input and entertainment, that the prospect of being alone with our thoughts feels uncomfortable or even frightening. We reach for our phones at the first moment of boredom or discomfort. We fill our schedules so completely that we never have to face the silence or the questions it might bring up. But it's in this silence, in this solitude, that we can begin to hear our own voice again. Not the voice that's been shaped by years of conditioning and expectation, but the voice that knows what we actually want, what actually matters to us, what actually brings us joy and fulfillment. This voice is often quiet, easily drowned out by the noise of daily life, but it's always there, waiting for us to listen. Thoreau discovered that when he listened to this inner voice, it often told him things that contradicted what society expected of him. It told him that he didn't need to accumulate wealth or status symbols to be happy. It told him that he found more satisfaction in watching the sunrise than in any material acquisition. It told him that a simple meal prepared with attention and gratitude was more nourishing than the most elaborate feast consumed mindlessly. It told him that a conversation with a genuine friend was worth more than a dozen superficial social interactions. These discoveries didn't make him a hermit or a misanthrope. In fact, they made him more present and engaged when he did interact with others. By learning to be content with himself, he became a better friend, a more interesting conversationalist, a more authentic human being. He wasn't seeking from others what he could only give himself. He wasn't using relationships to fill voids in his own sense of worth or purpose. This is one of the most important lessons from Thoreau's experiment, and it's particularly relevant for people feeling trapped in their 30s. Often, the feeling of being trapped comes not just from external circumstances, but from internal emptiness. We've built our lives around external achievements and acquisitions because we don't have a strong sense of our own inner worth and purpose. We need the validation of others, the accumulation of possessions, the achievement of status markers to feel okay about ourselves. But this creates a trap within a trap. Not only are we dependent on external circumstances for our sense of well-being, but we're constantly anxious about losing what we've gained or not gaining enough to feel secure. We become like addicts, needing increasingly larger doses of external validation to feel the same level of satisfaction. And like any addiction, this one ultimately leads to more pain than pleasure. Thoreau's solution was to develop what we might call inner resourcefulness. By spending time in solitude and simplicity, he learned to find satisfaction and contentment within himself. He discovered that he could be happy with very little as long as that little was chosen consciously and aligned with his values. He found that he could handle uncertainty and change because his sense of self wasn't dependent on external circumstances. This inner resourcefulness is what allows us to make different choices about our outer lives. When we're not desperate for external validation or security, we can afford to take risks, to let go of things that don't serve us, to pursue paths that feel authentic, even if they don't look impressive to others. We can downsize our homes, change our careers, end relationships that have run their course, say no to opportunities that don't align with our values. But developing this inner resourcefulness requires practice, and it requires us to go against much of what our culture teaches. We live in a society that profits from our discontent, that thrives on our feeling that we're not enough as we are, that we need to buy more, achieve more, become more to be worthy of love and respect. The advertising industry, the social media algorithms, even many of our educational and professional institutions are designed to keep us feeling inadequate and seeking external solutions to internal problems. Breaking free from this conditioning requires what Thoreau called civil disobedience, though in this context, it's more like psychological disobedience. We have to be willing to disobey the internal voices that tell us we're not doing enough, having enough, being enough. We have to be willing to disappoint others who have invested in our living according to their expectations rather than our own authentic desires. This is where Thoreau's philosophy becomes not just inspirational, but deeply practical. He wasn't advocating for a return to some idealized past or a rejection of all modern conveniences. He was advocating for consciousness, for deliberate choice, for the courage to live according to our own deepest wisdom rather than external pressures. In practical terms, this might mean starting each day with a few minutes of silence and reflection. Instead of immediately checking our phones, it might mean regularly evaluating our commitments and letting go of those that no longer serve us. It might mean spending time in nature, even if it's just a walk around the block or a few minutes in the local park. It might mean cooking a simple meal with attention and gratitude instead of grabbing fast food while multitasking. Most importantly, it means learning to distinguish between our wants and our needs, between what we think we should want and what we actually want, between what others expect of us and what we know to be true for ourselves. This distinction becomes clearer with practice, but it requires us to slow down enough to actually pay attention to our inner experience. Thoreau wrote that if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. This is one of his most famous quotes, and it speaks directly to the experience of feeling trapped or different or out of step with the world around us. Instead of seeing this as a problem to be solved, Thoreau suggests seeing it as information, to be honored. Maybe we feel trapped not because there's something wrong with us, but because we're trying to live according to a rhythm that isn't our own. Finding our own rhythm, our own pace, our own way of being in the world doesn't mean becoming selfish or irresponsible. It means becoming more truly ourselves, which ultimately allows us to contribute more authentically to the world around us. When we're living according to our own deepest values and desires, we have more energy, more creativity, more genuine love to offer others. But it does mean being willing to be different, to make choices that others might not understand, to prioritize things that our culture doesn't necessarily value. It means being willing to appear less successful by conventional standards, if that's what it takes to feel more alive and authentic. It means being willing to disappoint some people in order to honor ourselves and ultimately to become the kind of person who can offer something real and meaningful to the world. The beautiful thing about Thoreau's philosophy is that it's not prescriptive. He's not telling us exactly how to live, what choices to make, what to prioritize. Instead, he's offering us a way of thinking about life, a set of principles for making our own choices consciously and authentically. He's showing us that it's possible to step back from the rush and pressure of modern life, to examine our assumptions, to make different choices. His experiment at Walden Pond lasted just over 2 years, but its impact on his life and on the world has been immeasurable. He didn't stay in the woods forever, because that wasn't the point. The point was to learn what he needed to learn, to discover what he needed to discover, and then to return to the world with that knowledge and live differently. This is perhaps the most important lesson for those of us feeling trapped in our 30s and beyond. We don't have to completely overturn our lives to begin living more deliberately. We don't have to quit our jobs, sell our possessions, and move to a cabin in the woods, though if that's what calls to us, we shouldn't be afraid to consider it. What we need to do is begin the process of conscious examination, of deliberate choice, of living according to our own values rather than external expectations. This process might begin with small changes, small experiments in living more simply and deliberately. Maybe it's clearing out a closet and being more conscious about what we choose to keep and what we choose to let go. Maybe it's turning off our phones for an hour each day and spending that time in silence or in nature. Maybe it's saying no to one commitment that drains us and yes to something that energizes us. Over time, these small changes accumulate into larger shifts. We begin to trust our own judgment more and seek external validation less. We become more comfortable with solitude and less dependent on constant stimulation. We start to make choices based on what actually makes us happy rather than what we think should make us happy. We learn to live with less and enjoy it more. The feeling of being trapped begins to dissolve, not because our external circumstances necessarily change dramatically, though they might, but because we change our relationship to those circumstances. We realize that we have more choice than we thought we did, more power than we believed we had, more freedom than we'd allowed ourselves to experience. Thoreau returned from Walden Pond with the knowledge that it was possible to live simply and deliberately, to find contentment and meaning without constantly striving for more. He spent the rest of his life writing and speaking about these discoveries, encouraging others to conduct their own experiments in living, to find their own way of being in the world. His message to us across the centuries is both simple and revolutionary. We don't have to live lives of quiet desperation. We don't have to feel trapped by circumstances that seem beyond our control. We don't have to wait for permission or for perfect conditions to begin living more authentically. We can start where we are, with what we have, making small, conscious choices that gradually add up to a life that feels more like our own. The real reason we feel trapped after 30 isn't because life becomes more difficult or because we have fewer options. It's because we've accumulated layers of conditioning, expectation, and habit that have obscured our connection to our own authentic desires and values. But these layers can be examined, questioned, and gradually released. Underneath them is the person we've always been, the person who knows what brings us joy, what matters most deeply, what we actually need to feel fulfilled and at peace. Thoreau's solution isn't just a historical curiosity or a romantic ideal. It's a practical approach to living that's as relevant today as it was in 1845. In a world that's even more complex, more stimulating, more demanding than the one Thoreau knew, his principles of simplicity, deliberateness, and authentic living offer us a way forward, a path back to ourselves, a method for transforming the feeling of being trapped into the experience of being free.